I'm commonly asked by people, what are the steps in conflict resolution? So if you find yourself in the midst of a conflict, either as a participant or as an observer, and you want to figure out how do I break the impasse and help these parties come to a resolution, stick around because this video is for you. In this video, I'm going to share with you the 6 critical steps for conflict resolution that you can use to break impasse, to resolve conflicts to mutual advantage, and to build stronger relationships with others. So let me start with the first step, which is assessing the situation. So what does that mean? That really means identifying who are the stakeholders involved in this particular conflict. If it's a dispute between 2 siblings, right, it might look really simple. Maybe it's just the 2 siblings. But actually, if we think about it, it might be more than the 2 siblings. For example, maybe parents are involved in some way. And a really bigger conflict, one of the reasons why we want to assess who the stakeholders are is because there are the people who are maybe involved in the conflict, maybe the people who are sitting down at a negotiation table, but then there's a whole bunch of other players who actually care about the outcome, who might influence the party's ability to get to an outcome, who might be needed to help actually implement any decisions coming from that. And if we want to be effective, we need to do a really good assessment of all of the stakeholders, and then we need to identify what are the issues that are the sources of the conflict. So let's take an example like a divorce. In a divorce, there are a bunch of different issues. One might be who gets the marital home. Another might be issues of child custody and what the visitation might look like. Another might be, will there be alimony payments? Will there be child support involved? We want to identify what all of the issues are. Step number 1, we've assessed the situation by understanding who are the stakeholders and what are the issues. That allows us to move to this second step, which is moving from positions to interests. So what do I mean by that? Well, a position is what someone says they want in a particular conflict. And the way most of us actually go about resolving conflicts is we lay out our positions. Here's my demand, here's my offer, here's my position. But if we want to be really effective in conflict resolution, we need to look beyond the position to the underlying interest. What are the reasons why someone says they want what they want? So let me give you an example involving a conflict that I was in a bunch of years ago. This will sound really petty to all of you, but those of you who are maybe academics might be able to resonate with this a little bit because we academics, sometimes we fight over pretty petty things.
Oh, you are a petty man.
This one to me didn't feel that petty. I was teaching a class during the spring semester that had 168 people in it, meaning with me and my teaching assistant, I needed a room that could hold a little bit more than 168 people. There was a faculty member who wanted the one room in the law school who could hold that many people. So much of this conflict was managed through the registrar's office, who kept on telling me that unfortunately the other professor was insisting on getting the room with 170 chairs in it. This was utterly perplexing to me, except for the fact that the other professor was a very senior member of the faculty. And so at first glance, I thought this person is just using his clout to get a room that he thinks is nicer or prettier. Meanwhile, I will have no room for my classroom.
Sorry, no room.
So at last, I did something that I should have done much sooner, is I actually reached out to the professor himself. His position was he wanted this classroom. And I needed to understand what was the underlying interest behind that. Well, this made it a very easy conversation because what I learned was that the professor actually had hearing challenges, and the particular room was equipped with devices that would allow him to hear students better than the other classrooms in the school. So the interest he had was a really legitimate one, being able to hear his students during class. His position was, I want this big room.
Bob likes a big room, sir.
Of course, that leads to a whole possibility of solutions. So once I understood that the interest was that he wanted to be able to hear his students well, and once he understood that my interest was being able to have all of my students out of a class, it allowed for all sorts of possibilities. The one that we ended up landing on was that we got the school to actually upgrade a smaller classroom with the equipment needed so that the more senior professor could actually hear his students and take a smaller classroom. So this is just an example of a conflict that looked like two positions in battle, but once we got to the interest, we realized it wasn't zero sum. And so this leads to the third step in conflict resolution, which is using the interests to brainstorm options that might satisfy the parties. So once you have all of the interests on the table, it allows you to move into brainstorming period around value creating options. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean by brainstorming here, because I think brainstorming sometimes gets a bad name. But brainstorming done correctly can actually be a very generative, creative, and fun process. But there are actually some rules around it. Specifically, when we're in a brainstorming period, we want to come up with as many ideas as we can without evaluating whether they are good or bad. Oftentimes when I work with groups in brainstorming, I find that they're actually pretty good at not evaluating bad ideas, but the problem is they actually evaluate good ideas. So Joe says something and no one says anything. Good, that's not evaluation. Then McKay says something and everyone says, fabulous idea. Well, the problem, of course, is now Joe thinks his idea was no good. What we really need to do is have no evaluation during brainstorming. The other thing we want to avoid doing as much as possible is attaching ideas to names. So as soon as we say, let's look at Maddie's idea, or let's take a look at Santiago's idea, we have introduced a new problem. And that problem is what's called reactive devaluation. So let me tell you a little bit about the problem of reactive devaluation. Reactive devaluation is the tendency we have to actually downplay or dislike ideas that come from other people, especially other people on the other side of a conflict. So as soon as an idea gets labeled as being the idea of the other side, we might be more likely to like it less. And so during brainstorming, I want to make sure as much as possible that we are not attaching names to the ideas. We're just putting them all up on a whiteboard or a shared Google Doc. The last thing I want to do at this point is think about, are there low-cost, high-value trades that might be possible between the parties? Once we have all of the options, now we want to move to the fourth step, which is using criteria to decide among options. So what do we mean by criteria? Well, criteria are external standards of legitimacy by which we can evaluate the options. And so by external, what I mean is there's some objectivity to them. So for example, if I were trying to sell my car, one way we could agree on a price is that I just say, I think it's worth $23,000 because, that's what I feel like. But another way is we could look to an external standard of legitimacy, like what is the list price in Kelly's Blue Book? Or what does Carfax.com say? Looking to external criteria helps us land on outcomes that feel fair and legitimate to all. Let me tell you a story about myself where criteria helped us actually break a deadlock. So when I first started teaching negotiation many, many years ago, I was teaching with my colleague Patrick, and we had a disagreement about how to teach a particular unit in the class. So we were really stuck. How are we going to unlock this? What we suddenly realized is that we both had a tremendous respect for the person who had been our negotiation teacher when we were in law school. And so we agreed that we would ask her how she would teach this unit and that we would defer to whatever she said. So that external criteria, that is deferring to this particular expert, was successful for us in breaking that deadlock. Okay, so let's move on to the fifth step, which is making mutual commitments. Once we've identified the options, once we've used criteria, we now need to move to commitments. And whenever we make a commitment in a conflict, we want to make sure that what we're agreeing to is very specific and firm and operational. And when I say operational or implementable, I mean that both I and the other side can actually follow through on what it is we say. The other thing we want to think about is whether our agreement should be written out or not. There are pros and cons to writing out an agreement. The upside is that it forces some clarity and it can be easier to enforce. The downside is that sometimes, particularly in a more personal or relational situation, it can feel kind of legalistic or uncomfortable to have to write out the agreement. So I think whether you decide to write it out or not is up to you, but you should certainly make sure that the commitments you give and receive are specific, firm, and implementable. The last step is to really reassess to ensure that there is compliance with and satisfaction with the agreement as made. So depending on the nature of a conflict, it might make sense to build in some automatic review period to ensure that people are complying with the details and that the agreement is working. This is particularly important in situations like a workplace dispute or a family dispute, where there's continuing interaction beyond the agreement. Anywhere where parties will continue to work together, or where the agreement is complicated, or the situation on the ground might be constantly changing, is a time when you should build in reassessment and evaluation. So, let's review the 6 steps in conflict resolution. First, assess the situation, identifying issues and stakeholders. Second, move past positions to identify interests of all the parties. Third, engage in joint brainstorming to come up with options that meet the interests. Fourth, to choose among the options, identify criteria. Fifth, move to the commitment stage, identifying commitments that are specific, firm, and implementable. And lastly, build in a period of assessment and evaluation, being open to modifications if the outcome isn't being complied with or isn't meeting the parties' interests. So to keep learning, watch the next video, which is how to improve your negotiation skills. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the button. I'm Bob Bordone. Thanks for watching, and let's keep negotiating together. Here are the skills I was telling you about. Here's how to improve.